Welcome back, everybody. Our next guest has been the youngest ever winner of the Griffin Poetry Prize. What is that? Yeah, only the biggest and most important poetry prize in this country. Well, he has written now a deeply personal memoir entitled A History of My Brief Body, and it explores what it is like to navigate a broken world as a young, queer, Indigenous man. Please welcome to the show. We're so excited to have him, Billy Ray Belcourt. Welcome, Billy Ray.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Well, Billy Ray, I want to start off with language because we all know how important it is. Throughout your book, you used NDN as opposed to Indigenous. Can you maybe explain to our viewers what that means and just its significance?
So it's used in two ways. Firstly, as internet shorthand, so a way for Indigenous peoples to refer to themselves and one another in a way that doesn't use the dominant languages that we've inherited, for better or worse. So for many decades, we were known primarily by way of how others spoke about us. And so to me, this seems to be a small form of rebellion. And secondly, I've seen it used as an acronym to mean not dead native. And this, though jarring, perhaps holds on to a kind of defiant ethos that I wanted to hold on to as well, the refusal, that is, to succumb to colonial violence.
You know, also in this book, you do talk about the ideals around masculinity and as it relates to Indigenous men. How, when you speak about Indigenous men and their relationship with masculinity, does that reveal itself in your culture, and how has that been since challenged?
So there are many forms of masculinity that have been imported from elsewhere by way of colonization, primarily from Europe. And I think that part of the work of activists today, Indigenous activists, anti-colonial activists, is to do away with these more insidious, crueler forms of masculinity, ones that have to do with property, with possessorship, with domination, and instead, revitalize the older forms of masculinity, the ones that begin from Indigenous philosophies of relating that have care and flourishing at their core.
Sort of along the same lines, you take a different approach when you talk about your dating experiences in your book, and in particular, your experience with dating apps. And, you write about how you were using them perhaps as a help while you were living in Alberta in particular, but you also write that there are a lot of racial issues wrapped up in these apps for queer men in particular. Can you expand on that a little bit?
There are many who use racialized language, who lists racial preferences and the like on these apps, and having to be confronted by, the larger history of racism and colonialism in the country manifesting in these apps. And so a lot of the book charts my early encounters with men who fetishized me or who attempted to behave as though colorblind, and, feeling in my body, this deep desire for something more resonant with freedom, with, decolonial love, and seeing it as my job now to document part of these, darker facets of the queer world.
And another part of one of the darker facets that you allude to is medical negligence, which is a very vital, important conversation we need to have in this country. You yourself sought medical attention and were failed, frankly, by the medical system after, dealing with a very traumatic sexual experience. Can you shed a light on what you went through in that instance and maybe illuminate the huge problem when it comes to medical negligence, especially for the queer community?
Right. So in the span of one day, I sought medical attention from 3 different institutions in Edmonton, none of which could provide me the care that I both wanted and needed, and I was essentially sent away from each place. And this was partly because of a lack of deeper knowledge about queer life, queer sexual practices and the kinds of medical care that, we uniquely require. And thankfully, in the end, nothing happened with me. All was fine. But what came into focus for me was how even in these moments that can feel world altering, we can be denied the care that should be built into these institutions.
I want to talk to you, Billy Ray, about the horrific story of the Indigenous woman, Joyce Eshequan, who was taunted on her deathbed by nurses in hospital. This is a story that horrified Canadians, but I would imagine did not surprise Indigenous people across this country.
Right. So you're right to suspect that Indigenous peoples across the country were not entirely shocked by this moment of racism in a hospital. I myself have experienced particular kinds of racialized assumptions when seeking medical care. I've been asked if I've been faking my pain or being told to limit, the number of requests I could make from the doctor each visit. And so we see in moments like this, in heartbreaking moments like this, that there continues to need to be a profound rewiring of the ways of thinking of folks in these positions that can be, as we've seen, life and death.
You discuss the alarming suicide rates on reserves right across this country in your book as well. And what you write is that the public discourse needs to be drastically shifted in this area, in particular when it comes to talking about suicide and suicide prevention. How so?
So the term epidemic is often used to describe the incidence of suicide or attempted suicide on reserves. And this is a word that, in my opinion, sensationalizes rather than humanizes those who experience these kinds of oppressions. And also, because of its etymology as something that happens unexpectedly, it seems that in the usage of it, the government is suggesting and health officials are suggesting that they don't know what the underlying problems are. And we, as Indigenous people, do know what they are. They include the effects of colonization, housing shortages, lack of mental health supports, culturally safe medical care, not only in our communities, but also in urban centers. And so we do need to fix our sociological eye on the structural issues so that Indigenous people, Indigenous youth in particular, aren't driven to this kind of fate.
Now, Billy Ray, you are someone who does not shy away from going there when it comes to darkness in truth, but also this country's truth as well. But still, you wanted to position your book as one and a narrative of joy. Why was it so important to you to have joy at the core of this story?
So for so long, we, as Indigenous peoples, have been associated with trauma, with sadness, and though these do appear in our lives, as they do in everyone else's, we seldom are seen as joyous, as future-bound, as sovereign people. And so to center the narrative in joy, to say that we are people who first and foremost want joy in our lives, and practice joy in a whole host of ways, is to rebel against that grammar of despair and deficiency. And I think also that a theory of joy is a theory of freedom. I think that freedom is the most joyous experience one can have. And so to say that we want joy is to say that we want freedom.
Oh, wow. What a beautiful way to end this enlightening segment. Billy Ray, what a pleasure and an honor to get to speak with you today. Thanks for being with us.
It's my pleasure. Thank you so much.
We want to remind all of our viewers the memoir entitled A History of My Brief Body is available now everywhere. Please go out yourself, get yourself a copy and read it. We'll be right back right after this.